All right, so good morning, everyone. As you could probably guess, we're going to be turning to Jude today, and I'd like to get maybe a temperature of the room. Like, who's super excited that it's Jude again? Yes. Okay, great. For the rest of you, I'm going to just kind of let you in. We're going to be going through most of the harder stuff today, and then we will wrap up. Probably the plan is to wrap up in 2 weeks when next time I preach. So that is what's going to happen, Lord willing. I guess is the best way to put that. So last week we talked about how last week we talked about all of these different ways in which last week. I did it again, right? It's 2 weeks ago. I told you 2 weeks ago I was going to do this too. Last sermon we talked about how there were these patterns of ungodliness that we could learn from. This patterns of ungodliness in which not only does the pattern exist where these people that were given places of authority, these people that were given freedoms and given certain things by God, had them taken away or were displaced because they went into ungodliness. So not only the pattern of ungodliness, but also a pattern of judgment from God. And so in this passage, Jude is going to do a couple of things. And we're going to be, just so you know, if you turn to Jude, we're going to be going from about verse 9 to, I believe, 19. Yep, yeah, 9 to 19. So that's a full 11 verses. So this week, in this passage, what he's going to be talking about is, what is the motivation, maybe, behind some of these false teachers? These teachers that we kind of called teaching the gospel of ungodliness. That it doesn't matter what you do, and because everything's forgiven, because grace is so abundant, there's no moral norm, you can do whatever you want. And this is the people that he's plainly set out. He hasn't called them out by name, that's important, actually. But he's set it out there. And so what is their motivation? And also, how can we look for them without actually calling them out? So how can we become more aware of their presence? So let's go ahead and read what we read last sermon, and then we'll read into this week as well. So we'll start in verse 5. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desires, served as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Yet in a like manner, these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. And so here's where our lesson will come from here. It's in verse 9. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." But these people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Woe to them, for they walk in the way of Cain, and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. These are hidden reefs at your love feasts, as they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds swept away by winds, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted, wild waves of the sea casting up the foam of their own shame, wandering stars, for whom the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved forever. It was about these that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are grumblers, malcontents, following their own sinful desires. They are loud-mouthed boasters, showing favoritism to gain advantage. But you must remember, beloved, the predictions of the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ. They said to you, in the last time there will be scoffers following in their own godly passions. It is these who cause divisions, worldly people devoid of the Spirit. It's a lot in there. And what's going to happen in this passage is Jude is going to assume that you are going to be able to sort of get these little snippets of what he's talking about and fill in a whole lot of gaps. That you're going to be able to hear this story about Michael the archangel and kind of know what the story behind that is, which again, that doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from another biblical text we'll get into called the Testament of Moses, an extra biblical text called the Testament of Moses. And then, what is Balaam all about, and what happened there? What was Korah's rebellion? And so, I debated about whether or not to say this joke, but I think I'll say it because I've already announced that there's a joke coming. But yeah, these are the kinds of things that, if your wife doesn't know what these things are about, she should probably ask you when you get home. No, because you should probably know. You should probably know and be able to elaborate on these things. So what I'd like to do is kind of look at some of these examples in the beginning and kind of make sure that we're all on the same page of what happened. Like, what is he referencing? And so we can get something out of it. So what he does, he kind of starts with this contrast of these people. He starts with a contrast of Michael the archangel disputing over the body of Moses with Satan. It's like, what is this story about? I don't remember reading this in Exodus or Deuteronomy, and I haven't read Leviticus, but I'm pretty sure it's not there too, right? No, I actually have read Leviticus. That was a joke too. But no, what's going on? What is he talking about? Well, if you remember, Moses also sinned in the desert. And so this testimony of Moses, this book, The Witness of Moses, it's also translated as. We don't have a full copy of it today. It's not something, it's much less disputed that this is something that really ought to be read today. It's just something, a story that they would be familiar with. It's not something you really need to go and read. And even if you wanted to, there's not really a good copy of it today. But from what we know of it, what it describes is that because Moses sinned in the desert, he wasn't allowed to enter the promised land. And so there was this dispute about where would his body lay. Would it go ahead and rot in the desert? Or, because it can't enter the promised land, would it be taken to somewhere else by God to bury himself, which is in the Bible? Or would it possibly be taken to heaven, to his body, dead and all, would be assumed into heaven. So there was all these different options of what might happen to the body, and the devil wanted Moses' body to rot in the desert. It's just sort of this unconsecratedly, And so the Michael, archangel, from that text, we would understand that being the same rank as far as angelic forces as Satan. Not exactly clear in the Bible, but in this text would be more clear. Doesn't presume, even though he would have complete right to say, you're in the wrong, I'm in the right, I rebuke you. And by the way, the same Michael that in the book of Enoch, when you're talking about, and some of the other archangels, gathered up some of the other dark powers we talked about this a couple weeks ago, in that book of Enoch, they took the dark powers and they put them in a gloomy darkness underground, and they're in chains until the judgment. He wasn't able to do the same with Satan, because Satan has to be bound by someone higher than himself, not by Michael. And so he doesn't presume. He doesn't give himself authority that wasn't given to him. So the Lord rebuke you. It's really not any more complicated than that. I don't know if we can. I've heard people try to say things like you can get all sorts of interesting, like you can have the power to bind Satan by saying the Lord. It's not that by just saying these words. What he's saying is this is a contrast of these other people. He's giving his humility in this moment, whereas these other people are giving signs of pride. So let's go on to the other examples. Cain. What happened with Cain? That's probably a more familiar story. Cain fell into sin because he couldn't understand God's judgment. He couldn't understand why God accepted Abel's sacrifice and didn't accept his sacrifice. And because God had made this decision, Abel's sacrifice is accepted, Cain's is not. There's not actually a clear understanding in the Bible why. It's like some of us wonder, what was the reason? We try to make up stories. It's not actually there in the Bible. It's just God's judgment. He didn't accept Cain's sacrifice, and this really got to him. So instead of humbly accepting God's judgment, he doesn't do that. He allows sin to enter, and so he kills his brother. And that's how he entered sin. What about Balaam? Balaam was the next one mentioned here. What was his pattern? What was going on there? Balaam is famous because he was riding the donkey that God allowed to talk to him and all that stuff. But the main Balaam error that Balaam had in the Bible is that even though he was a prophet who actually heard from God, and even though he legitimately gave the king of Moab the prophecy that God gave him to give 3 times, even though Moab said, "You will not be in my favor and you will not receive your reward, and I might even harm you if you don't give me a curse on Israel." And God told Balaam over and over again, "I have decided to bless Israel, not curse them, so you may not curse them." But Moses reveals that Balaam went back to the king of Moab and counseled him how to lead the Israelites into sin so that God would not bless them anymore and curse them. I'm not able to curse them. God won't let me curse them. But I will teach you how to lead them into all sorts of sinful acts and into idolatry. And then you'll be able to. And that ended up happening. Many Israelites died after they started worshiping Baal on Balaam's advice. And so Balaam is the prophet that was more interested in his own standing before the king, his own favor with the king, his own reward from the king, than anything that God had to say. God had said, "I want to bless Israel," and he wasn't interested in that. He wanted to find a way around it. Korah's rebellion, what's that about? We'll talk about that for real quick. It comes from Numbers 16. It's something that may or may not be familiar with you. But Korah was from the tribe of Levi. And Moses had declared that the Levites would be the holy ones who were chosen to be the priesthood. And Korah said, "Wait, I'm a Levite," and Moses had cut off. It was only actually his bloodline of the Levites that would be the priesthood. And he said, "Wait, we're Levites. We're all holy. Not only should I be in the priesthood, but these people here, these are sons of Reuben. They were elders. These are sons of Reuben. They should be in the priesthood too. They are just as holy as you. And who are you to set yourself up higher? You've gone too far this time, Moses." And so Moses gives them a challenge, which Korah, for some reason, accepted. Very, very foolishly accepted. And he says, "How about this? We're all going to burn incense. And whoever's incense God accepts, whoever incense God accepts, that's the one who's God's chosen to be the ones to make sacrifices to him and be in the holy place, in the temple, when it's built." And so they went through with this. They were able to recruit 250 of the various people to also burn incenses with them. And the Bible says that the earth swallowed up Korah and his 2 companions, and the grave took them alive. And then it says that fire came down from the sky and burned up the 250 that also offered the incense under Korah, because Korah's arrogance and pride had made him say, "I don't care what you say about what's holy and what's not holy. I'm placing myself in a place of authority to say that I'm just as holy as you." So, also ignoring God's lines of judgment as well. So Cain shows us how pride hinders our willingness to accept God's judgment. Balaam shows us that pride can cause even legitimate prophets to find their way around what God wants. And Korah shows us how arrogance in matters of holiness is something that God will not tolerate. So that's what Jude is setting up. He's, again, giving some motivation. He's saying it's these people's arrogance and it's their pride and it's their assumption of things that they do not have that make them so dangerous and make them worthy of him writing this entire letter to warn people about. He goes on a little bit more even to talk about how important it is, and we'll get to that in a minute. So Jude wants us to understand and recognize divisive teachers of unrighteousness. And he shows how pride, which is the deadliest and most deceptive of sins, can cause these false teachers to hide where they are dangerous and proclaim power that they don't have. They hide the places where they're dangerous and they proclaim power they don't have. And he gives these different examples going on. He talks about them being hidden reefs. So hidden dangers under the water. Dangers in the water are why we build lighthouses. It's why we set out buoys to warn of where these reefs are sometimes in the ocean. It's this idea that on the surface everything looks calm, but if you tread into that area, it's dangerous for everyone who happens upon them. He calls them self-serving shepherds. So rather than being interested actually in feeding God's sheep and being a servant of God and feeding other people, they are more interested in what they can get out of people. They're more interested in using the flock for their own good than actually using the flock. Not using the flock, but guiding the flock and feeding the flock themselves and giving of themselves to help the flock. He calls them waterless clouds and fruitless trees. And you should understand, what is a waterless cloud than something that says it gives promises that it cannot fulfill? It lifts itself on high, it promises rain, you expect rain, it's unable to fulfill the promise that it has. It keeps promising something again and again, but no matter how far you follow it, it will never rain. Same thing with a fruitless tree. It's in the fall, it should be ripe, the leaves are in bloom, but you're not going to get anything nutritious from it. And what's interesting is he talks about these are people that Enoch prophesied about. We're going to get, by the way, to those in a second. I'm going to follow up. I just kind of want to go through some of this, what Jude is talking about. He talks about how how Enoch prophesied about these people. This is, again, going back to the book of Enoch. What's interesting about that is he's saying that just as the Old Testament foreshadowed all sorts of things that we take for granted today, foreshadowed Jesus' life, foreshadowed the life of the church together, and also these errors of these people in the Old Testament are foreshadowing this exact thing of teachers of ungodliness being among and in the church and convincing people to abandon true grace for like a cheap grace or an ungodly grace, a grace that doesn't change, a grace that allows you to live whatever life you want to live and doesn't demand anything of you. And what's fantastic for me is to imagine that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, way long time ago, pre-flood, right? Pre-Abraham, pre-Mosaic law, pre-David, pre-kingdom, is prophesying about those people in these days. Not just because they are being sinners, but because they're directly opposing God's will and intentions for the salvation of his people. And then he talks about this idea at the end. I mean, it's kind of, because he just sort of, after that, reemphasizes what he's talking about. And toward the end of what we're here, he says, remember what they said to you that in the last time, this is verse 18, there will be scoffers following their own ungodly passions. It is these who cause divisions, worldly people devoid of the Spirit. So you ask yourself, what is the connection between this pride and being devoid of the Spirit? And I think that kind of goes with that waterless cloud idea. That idea that they are setting themselves up as superior in their spirituality. I have a superior spirituality, and I can gift you with all sorts of things of the Spirit, and you will be you'll be so powerful if you follow me, and you'll get all these things if you follow me, and never ever delivers on them. The waterless cloud could also be an example of someone who simply does not have the Spirit. So let's go back to the example of Michael from before. How Michael was the counterexample, was the contrast to these people. Because if other people in their pride hide what is dangerous about them, the humble expose what is dangerous about them. They make it known to others, so others know where your rough edges are. Others know what they need to be careful of. And if those who are proud express that they have power that they don't really have, those who are humble know what power they don't have and aren't quick to try to convince others of power they even have. Humility is a hard quality to develop, is it not? In fact, I have a hard time even wanting to talk about humility, although I think humility is the key to understanding the counterexample here. But I don't like talking about things that I don't know much about. But I'm going to try a little bit here. By the way, it's such a deceptive, pride is such a deceptive thing before we get into humility. And I think I've probably told the story to some of you before. I might even have said it in the sermon before, but it's a pretty common story. But it goes a long way to say there was a preacher who was giving a series on the 7 deadly sins. And every week he'd go through another sin, and then it was all planned out. People knew when it was. And when he was going to give the sermon on pride, like very, very few people showed up. And he was thinking to himself, oh wow, like they're really scared of this sermon, aren't they? They must be so scared of this sermon. They must really understand that this is going to be a hard sermon for them. And then he finds out that most people didn't show up because they thought pride was the one they didn't really deal with that much. But humility, on the other hand, is all but impossible to fake. Have you ever met people that are really into enlightenment and really into ego death, and at the same time they can't shut up about it? Anyway, it's self-contradictory, though, to be pleased with yourself for acting humble. And C.S. Lewis mentions this. He observes how in any conversation, the person who believes himself to be more humble in that conversation is probably the one being less humble in the conversation. It's something that you can't see. It's something that's really difficult to judge. And I'm not an expert in humility. Like I said, it's not something I understand a whole lot about, but I'd like to give maybe two different ideas of how we might pursue humility to avoid the error of pride and be those whom, not those whom he's talking about here, if that makes sense. The first thing I would like to suggest about developing humility, well, and before we even talk about that, let's get into the idea that all of us have the capacity to grow in humility. And if you don't think you can, I have some really hard-hitting news for you. But the first thing is to simply praise humility when you see it. If you imagine that pride grows even more proud when it tries to expose pride in others, humility has the same effect, where humility will grow in humility when it praises humility in others. And while Jesus is the only true, consistent example of humility that we have, there are other less humble but still good examples of humility in the Bible that we can also praise, at least those actions, such as Mary accepting the Son of God in her womb, Paul understanding all others as greater than himself, Joseph showing forgiveness toward his brothers even though they had sold him to Egypt as a slave. But Jesus, being equal with God himself, made himself to have no reputation, took on disgrace and humiliation, and offered good for evil all along the way, even for those who crucified him to death on the cross. This is praiseworthy, and understanding the position of praising the humble can help put us on a path toward humility. The second way I want to talk about is recognizing your own weaknesses and your own sin. The foolishness that is truly foolishness of being proud of yourself in any situation. I'm going to give you some ideas of times when it's probably a good time to start being humble, or things that happen in your life in which you can say, maybe now's a good time to be humble. Every rash decision that defeats your common sense. Anger that overtakes your calm. Every time you regret saying something that you said. Every time self-control is taken over by a craving. Every time anxiety robs you of your rest, or fear takes you of your peace, or when you're unable to wait for something that is good. These are opportunities to seek forgiveness for your pride and be humble before God. And God has seen fit to allow our continual dependence on his mercy as we do these things all the time. I know I do. Our continual dependence on his mercy to be the place where humility is born and nurtured. And that's really where we're going to finish for today. All of this, again, understand, all of this was firmly in God's head. It was always in his mind, all the way from the beginning. Jude talks about Enoch, the seventh from Adam, long before the law was given, prophesying about these things and condemning those who are prideful and taking on positions of holiness and power and spiritual authority that they don't have in our day. Jude has given us buoys in the ocean to help us steer clear of these threats. Again, next time, some of the most beautiful words in Scripture we're going to go over. It's going to be a much different change of pace. It's going to be a shift in the way that these are going. But this week I encourage you to read these last verses, starting in verse 20 through 25. I really do. Read the last verses slowly and savor them, because they're very, very, very sweet, and they are the reward for getting through all of these difficult verses. All right, let's stand and sing.